In this video we're going to be revisiting the Google Pixel 7 Pro. So this phone was released about a year and a half ago as Google's flagship device. It's now been superseded by the Google Pixel 8 Pro, but for the last year I've been dailying this phone, so in this video we're going to be revisiting the Google Pixel 7 Pro, covering my experiences with this phone in terms of battery life, camera, performance and daily usability, to hopefully help you decide whether or not you want to pick up one of these phones in 2024, because I've seen these devices for as low as £300–400 on the used market. So this phone could now be a very good deal. So as always, there'll be timestamps below if there's a certain part of the video you're interested in. So we're going to start this video off by having a look at the design of this phone. So whether or not you like the design of this phone is very subjective, but I'm personally a fan of the design of this phone. I think the glass back looks very nice. I am a fan of the shiny metal edges. I do think it makes the phone feel quite premium. And then on the back, there's the iconic shiny metal camera bump. So I got my Pixel 7 Pro in black. I believe this is called Obsidian Black. I have heard other reviewers say that the metal band and the metal edging, because it's so shiny, it can become scratched quite easily, but I've not had that issue. I think there's probably two main reasons for this. One, because I've pretty much always kept this phone in a case, and the other is because of my colour choice. I think the Obsidian Black phone has slightly darker metal. I think most of the issues with visible scratches were on the white version of this phone because it has a slightly lighter coloured metal. Flipping the phone over to the front, you're greeted with a 6.7-inch OLED Quad HD 120Hz display. Now even in 2024 I'm still very impressed with this display. I know there are newer displays on newer phones that are brighter, but the screen on the 7 Pro is still very impressive. So the screen on the 7 Pro can get up to 950 nits and is definitely very visible outside. Also the colours of this screen are very vibrant and bright with inky blacks because it is an OLED screen. Now there was one controversial thing about the display of the 7 Pro, and that is the fact that it's curved. So I remember about 6 or 7 years ago when having a curved phone was actually a positive, but it's quite interesting that we've now all decided that curved displays aren't that desirable. In my opinion, I don't really care too much about the curved display. I would probably rather it be flat, and that's because, like a lot of people, I wanted to put a screen protector on my phone, and curved tempered glass screen protectors are way more expensive and harder to install than just a typical flat one. So that's the only inconvenience that having a curved display is actually presented to me. But if having a curved display is a deal breaker, then they did remove the curved display on the Pixel 8 Pro. So before we carry on with the next part of this video, if you are enjoying, be sure to hit that subscribe button. It really helps out the channel. We're on the road to 3,000 subscribers, which is absolutely amazing. That's the end of this shameless plug. Let's get on with the video. So we're next going to talk about the battery life of the Google Pixel 7 Pro. So this phone comes with a 5,000 mAh battery, which is fairly decent, but it does seem to be the standard battery size for a phone of this size. So overall, my impressions of the battery in this phone have been good. I found that this phone nearly always gets me to the end of the day with about 20 to 30% battery left. So for my day job, I work in a hospital, and I've always had this get me to the end of a 12-hour shift, so that's the main test. This phone does give you the option to reduce the screen resolution and refresh rate to save battery, but I've never had to do that. But in terms of the battery, one thing to note is that this phone doesn't support fast charging. It does support fairly quick charging, but not fast charging. I think the max charging rate for this phone is about 23 watts, which isn't super quick, but this phone does actually support wireless charging, which is good to see. But unfortunately this phone is a little bit too large to fit in the wireless charger in my car, which is disappointing. So overall, I've not been disappointed with the battery life of this phone. I think it's fairly decent, about 5 to 6 hours of screen on time. So we're next going to talk about the cameras, which is probably the first thing you think of when someone says Pixel device. So I'm going to say I've got an interesting opinion with the camera system on this phone. I'm not just going to give this camera system praise. I do think there are some negatives that I'm going to discuss. So in terms of camera system, it's got the trio that pretty much all high-end phones have at this point. It has an ultra-wide shooter, a main camera and a telephoto lens. I'm going to start off by reviewing each of these lenses individually. So we're going to start off by talking about the main shooter, which is a 50 megapixel sensor that uses pixel binning to produce a 12 megapixel photo. Now photos taken from the main lens nearly always look really good, which is as to be expected. I've heard some reviewers say that the images look a little bit over processed, but that's the standard Pixel look. I think 99% of the time you'll be impressed with the photos taken from the main shooter. The images tend to be sharp with very vibrant colours, and the main thing is this lens has very good dynamic range. So I would give the main shooter a 9 out of 10. I think it's a good lens. Now my thoughts on the ultra wide, I am still very impressed with the ultra wide. I think it is one of the best ultra wides out there. So the field of view is fairly wide. The images are decently sharp with good colours and dynamic range, but obviously the images aren't quite as good quality as the main shooter because the sensor's a lot smaller on the ultra wide. So the main difference is you'll find that images taken with the ultra ultra-wide camera will become grainier a lot quicker in low light conditions, whereas the main shooter is really good in low light. And before getting this phone, I had the iPhone 11, which was one of the first iPhones to have a wide-angle camera. And coming from that phone, I'm very impressed with how much better the wide-angle camera looks on this phone compared to that phone. Obviously that phone is a couple of years older, but wide-angle cameras on phones have come quite a long way. So I'd probably give the wide-angle camera an 8 out of 10. So next we're going to discuss the telephoto lens. So this Pixel 7 Pro has a 5x telephoto. And this lens is an interesting one because in good lighting conditions it can take some really good looking photos. I'll be putting some example photos on screen, but obviously compared to the main lens, the low light performance of this telephoto lens is just nowhere near as good. So overall I've been pretty impressed with the camera selection on the back of the 7 Pro. I think it makes the phone very versatile when it comes to taking photos. And I think the phone should be fairly decent in pretty much any shooting scenario. So before we move on from the camera, there have been some negatives. So first of all, I found the shooting experience not to be as fast as I would have liked. I think this might be down to Google's Tensor G2 chip, which powers this phone, being not quite as powerful as some of the competition. So what this means is using the camera app hasn't been as smooth as I would have liked. Some examples of this is switching between the various focal lengths can be a bit laggy, and when you compare this to an iPhone which can switch between all 3 lenses seamlessly, it's a bit disappointing to see that this phone lags when you switch between the different lenses. Another area where the lack of processing power shows is when taking photos. When I've wanted to take multiple photos in quick succession, the phone has become quite slow, and I've had it sometimes where after the 4th or 5th photo the phone has just refused to take any more photos, and there's still a post-processing delay present, so when you take a photo it can take up to about 5 seconds for the phone to add the post-processing effects to that photo. And this is something that was present back on the original Pixel, so it's quite disappointing that they've not improved that for this phone. And there's one more thing in terms of taking photos that I believe could be improved further, and that is the autofocus. So I found the autofocus on this phone to be okay. Most of the time it's able to get good focus, especially when you're shooting with the main lens, but I have had it a number of times, especially when shooting with a telephoto lens where it misses focus, or it can take a couple of seconds to actually find focus, which is something that makes the shooting experience with this phone a little bit less enjoyable. So I definitely think there's room for improvement with the autofocus on this phone. And the final thing we're going to discuss with the cameras is the video. So overall I think the video quality is good. Not amazing, but good. This camera can shoot up to 4K 60 frames per second or 4K 30 frames per second in HDR. I think when you're shooting video, the colors and the dynamic range are really good. And even though I think the video quality is decent and very acceptable for a smartphone, there are a few areas where it could be improved. The first being the overall resolution. So even though this phone shoots in 4K, it's not very good 4K. The 4K shot on this phone is very comparable to 1080p shot on my mirrorless camera. 4K footage just for some reason doesn't have as much detail as I would have expected from 4K footage. And the final room for improvement with the video is overheating. So I've had it a few times where I've tried to shoot footage at 4K 60 frames per second and this phone has become quite warm. I've even had it once when I was shooting video outside. To be fair, it was a sunny day where this phone became so hot that it refused to carry on taking video. So that's something to be aware of if you live in a country where it's warmer and you like shooting 4K footage, then the phone might overheat. So next we're going to talk about the performance of the Google Pixel 7 Pro. So this is an interesting one because this phone uses Google's 2nd generation G2 Tensor chip, and when this phone first came out in 2022, it benchmarked a lot lower than alternative Snapdragon and Apple phones. So it is quite interesting to see how the performance of this phone has held up over the last year and a half. So I have actually been satisfied with the performance of this phone. I would say I've rarely been in situations where I've wished that this phone was slightly quicker or slightly more powerful. But I do want to say that I'm someone that doesn't use their phone for gaming, and I don't do any editing on my phone, so I mainly just use my phone for checking emails, browsing the web. So there's not really anything that I do with my phone that's that intensive. But it may be the case that if you're a power user, someone that games a lot on their phone and does a lot of video editing, then you might be disappointed with the performance of this phone. So in terms of the performance, it is very app specific, and it all depends on how well optimized the app is for the Google Tensor chip. And I have just been talking about the camera app being laggy, so it's very disappointing to see that For some reason, Google hasn't managed to optimize the camera app to run well on this phone, but there are about 20% of apps that I found to run a little bit laggy on this phone. I've not really found any apps that have flat out refused to run. There have been a few apps on this phone that are maybe less well optimized. And the main thing that you notice is that the screen refresh rate doesn't run at 120 Hz, it drops frames. And it's also worth mentioning, because this phone has 12 gigabytes of RAM, you find that a lot of apps stay open in the background, which is good. So overall, I'd probably give the performance a 7 out of 10. It's not amazing, it's not groundbreaking, but for the average user, it'll be absolutely fine. But if you're a mobile gamer, I'd probably recommend looking at an iPhone or a Snapdragon-based Android phone. So finally, we're going to talk about the software experience of the Google Pixel 7 Pro. So as a Pixel device, it runs a very minimalist version of Android, and by default, this phone runs the Pixel launcher, and it's a launcher that I'm still using. I think all Google Pixel devices have provided a very good Android experience. So if you're after a very stock-like experience, then a Pixel device is probably the way to go. The Pixel devices have also been very good at having software updates. So the Pixel 7 and 7 Pro will be receiving Android updates until the end of 2025. So if you do decide to get this phone in 2024, then there'll still be a year and a half of software updates, and then a further 2 years until 2027 of security updates. So overall, over the last year of using this phone, I've been very satisfied with the software experience. This phone has never felt like it's been behind on software updates, and the software experience of this phone is good for someone that doesn't want a very cluttered experience. It's very minimalist. And I do remember a lot of reviewers when the Google Pixel 6 Pro came out saying that the software experience was a little bit buggy, and I am glad to report with the Google Pixel 7 Pro, I've had basically no software glitches or bugs. My phone has never been factory restored. I've been using it since day one, and I've got like 100 or so apps on the phone. So I know in the past that some Pixel devices have slowed down over time when you've installed more apps. This hasn't really been the case with this phone, which is good to see. I've also not experienced any battery drainage from installing third-party apps, which has been an issue with other Android phones. So in conclusion, should you pick up a Google Pixel 7 or 7 Pro in 2024? So I've seen these phones going for as low as £350, which is a really good deal. And you are getting a flagship phone from only a year and a half ago. This phone has a really good screen, a decent camera system, some okay performance, and some decent software. So who would I recommend one of these phones for? I'd recommend this to someone that wants a pure Android experience with the latest software updates, someone that wants a decent camera system that they can rely on. So the only group of people I wouldn't recommend this phone to are people that want to use their phone for mobile gaming. With the Google Tensor G2, this definitely isn't a gaming phone. But yeah, if you can find this phone for a good price, it is a very good deal. So hopefully this video has been informative. If you have enjoyed, be sure to hit that subscribe button. It really helps out the channel. We're going to try and aim for 20 likes on this video, and I will see everyone in my next video.